Now, before we dive into the text, I need to be honest with you about the man behind it. When we study philosophers like Plato or Descartes, we have biographies, letters, dates of birth, and death certificates. With Badarayana, we have almost none of that. The historical reality is stark. Very little is known about him personally. We don't know his birth date, his place of origin, or specific details of his life. In fact, many modern scholars suspect that Badarayana may not even be a single individual at all. There are two compelling reasons to view him as a collective figure or a school, rather than one man. The textual style. The Vedanta Sutra reads like a compilation of arguments from a tradition over time, rather than the linear thought process of a single author. Third-person references. Significantly, the text refers to Badarayana in the third person, just as it does for Jaimini. This suggests the name might represent a lineage or a specific school of thought that compiled these aphorisms to systematize Upanishadic teachings. Some later traditions attempted to solve this mystery by identifying Badarayana with Vyasa, the legendary compiler of the Vedas and author of the Mahabharata. But historians agree this is likely a pious attribution, a way to grant the text divine authority, rather than historical fact. So, when we talk about Badarayana's philosophy, we are really talking about the philosophy of a school that crystallized around the 5th century CE. They were the ones who decided that the scattered insights of the Upaniṣads needed to be organized into a rigorous, systematic defense of Brahman. And while their leader remains a shadow, their philosophical impact is unmistakable. Alright, let's talk about one of the most influential and most misunderstood texts in Indian philosophy. We're diving into Badarayana's Vedanta Sutra, composed in the 5th century CE. Now, before we go any further, I need you to understand something crucial. This text has more names than a spy with multiple passports. It's called the Vedanta Sutra, the Brahma Sutra, the Uttara Mimamsa Sutra, and the Chararaka Sutra. And here's what's remarkable. This confusing welter of titles is actually perfect, because the text's core mission is to investigate a single source of all things that presents itself in many guises. That source is Brahman. The Vedanta Sutra asks the big questions. How is Brahman the source of everything? What's the relationship between our individual selves and this transcendent principle? How can we come to know Brahman? And here's the payoff. It promises liberation from the karmic consequences of bodily existence if we attain this knowledge. Now, you might be thinking this sounds like a systematic work of cosmology, and you'd be right to think that. But here's the catch. The system is not easy to extract. This text is compressed, cryptic, and downright difficult to understand without help. That's where Shankara comes in. His 8th century commentary became so influential that many people today think Vedanta equals Shankara's interpretation. But we're going to resist that temptation. We're going back to the source to understand what Badarayana himself was up to before later commentators got their hands on it. Here's where it gets weird. The Vedanta Sutra is a philosophical treatise that doubles as a work of exegesis. It's devoted to interpreting the Upaniṣads, especially the Chandogya Upanishad, but also the Bādarāyaṇaka and others. Remember, Vedanta probably means at the end of the Veda, referring to these texts. But here's what makes this text so challenging. It reads the Upaniṣads as putting forward a single, coherent doctrine centered on Brahman. Think about that for a second. The Upaniṣads were composed over centuries by different authors with different concerns, and Badarayana is saying, no, there's one unified teaching here. That's a bold interpretive move, but wait, it gets more interesting. The sutra rarely identifies which passages it's interpreting. You need to know the Upaniṣads so intimately that a single keyword triggers recognition of the entire passage. Let me give you an example that perfectly captures this. There's a sutra that says simply, because of abiding and eating. That's it. 3 words in Sanskrit. Now, if you don't know your Upaniṣads, this is completely incomprehensible. But if you do, you immediately recognize the reference to the Mandukya Upanishads passage about 2 birds sitting in a tree, one eating, the other just sitting quietly. The eating bird symbolizes the individual soul engaged in worldly action. The bird that just abides represents Brahman, unchanging and eternal. See how much philosophy is packed into those 3 words? This is why the text is nearly impossible to read without commentary. The philosophical battles here are fought on exegetical grounds. The question isn't just what's true, but what does the sacred text actually teach? Now let's talk about a fascinating rivalry that shapes the entire text. You remember Jaimini from our discussion of Purva Mimamsa, the guy obsessed with Vedic ritual? Well, Badarayana is mentioned in the Mimamsa Sutra, and Jaimini is mentioned in the Vedanta Sutra. Both texts refer to their supposed authors in the third person, which tells us something interesting about how these texts were compiled. But here's what really matters. When these two disagree, it's Badarayana's view that triumphs in the Vedanta Sutra, and they disagree about fundamental things. Jaimini placed all his focus on Vedic ritual. The householder's sacrificial duties were everything. Badarayana, he's more interested in liberation through knowledge of Brahman. At one point, the text even says that someone with Brahman knowledge can dispense with lighting ritual fires. Can you imagine how radical that would have sounded? The entire Vedic tradition was built on ritual sacrifice, and here's Badarayana saying, yeah, you can skip that part if you've got the knowledge. This isn't just a minor disagreement. Badarayana emphasizes the superiority of the ascetic life over the householder's life. Knowledge of Brahman is valued for its own sake, not as a supplement to help us understand ritual. There are other disagreements too. Can gods achieve liberation? Badarayana says yes. Jaimini restricts this to humans and even denies the existence of gods. Is the Veda eternal with no origin? Both accept this, but Badarayana also says the Veda has its source in Brahman. These tensions run throughout the text. Okay, time for a reality check. How can we believe that all things were produced by Brahman, given that Brahman is transcendent above those things? This is the objection that any serious thinker would raise. It seems impossible that a cause could give rise to things utterly unlike it. How does the formless produce form? How does the unchanging produce change? Badarayana's response is almost dismissive in its brevity. Such things are known to happen. That's it. He doesn't even bother to provide examples, but Shankara's commentary fills in what he might have meant. Scorpion spontaneously generated from manure. The living emerging from the dead. Hair and fingernails growing from living bodies. The inanimate coming from what's living. Now we know these examples are scientifically wrong, but that's not the point. The philosophical principle is what matters. Causes can produce effects unlike themselves. But the objector persists. Why would Brahman even bother to produce the world? And here's where Badarayana gives us one of the most intriguing concepts in the text. Lila, which means play or sport. Brahman creates the world out of mere play. Not out of necessity, not out of need, not out of desire, just play. Think about what that implies. Brahman isn't lacking anything that creation would fulfill. There's no cosmic loneliness, no need for self-expression. It's spontaneous, free, creative activity, without purpose beyond itself. This is Badarayana using Aristotelian language. Brahman is both the efficient cause, the maker, and the material cause, the stuff things are made from. The universe has great material, the best possible in fact, Brahman itself. But hold on, something doesn't add up here. If Brahman is the source of all things, isn't Brahman also responsible for all the suffering and unjust inequality we see in the world? This is the problem of evil, Indian philosophy style. Wouldn't Brahman have had good reason not to create a world like this? Badarayana concedes the point but deflects the blame. All suffering, he says, is punishment for wicked deeds committed in past lives. Since the cycle of rebirth, samsara, has been going on endlessly, any particular case of suffering can always be referred back to earlier actions that justify it. This is crucial. The cycle is beginningless. There's no first moment where we could say, aha, that's where the injustice started. It goes back infinitely. This is actually a point of agreement between Mimamsa and Vedanta. Both accept that the world has always existed much as it does now, with beginningless karma explaining current circumstances. The difference? Badarayana insists this eternal world has its source in Brahman, whereas for Jaimini, that notion is foreign. Think about what this means for theodicy, the justification of divine goodness in the face of evil. Brahman isn't creating suffering from scratch. Brahman is the ground of a beginningless process where beings create their own suffering through their actions. It's a different move than you'd see in Western philosophy, where you typically have a creation moment and have to explain why God chose to create a world with suffering. Here, there's no such moment. The problem is shifted from creation to the eternal cycle itself. Now let's look at how the world actually unfolds from Brahman. And here's where things get interesting because this sequence is going to remind you of something we saw in the Upaniṣads. Remember when Yajnavalkya was challenged by Gargi to provide the fundamental principle upon which all things are woven? He eventually satisfied her by saying that principle is space. Badarayana accepts this and infers that space is the very first effect of Brahman, or at another point that space is even identical to Brahman. From space emerge other principles, and this will probably remind you of Greek cosmology. Air, fire, water, and earth, produced one after another with Brahman as their ultimate source. But here's what makes this different from Greek philosophy. These elements will eventually return to Brahman, dissolving back into it in the reverse order of their generation when the world cycle finally ends. Earth dissolves into water, water into fire, fire into air, air into space, and space back into Brahman. Then the whole cycle starts again. It's cosmology as an eternal rhythm. Notice what this tells us about Brahman's relationship to the world. Brahman is both the moving cause that gives rise to all things and somehow the stuff out of which things are made. The text says Brahman is the support of heaven, earth, and all other things. Though it takes on the forms of other things, becoming space, air, fire, water, earth, and everything made from them, Brahman remains formless in itself. So what is Brahman like in itself? This is where things get tricky, because Brahman is characterized in various ways throughout the Upaniṣads, and the Vedanta Sutra freely admits this. But many of these characterizations are metaphors, and we need to be careful not to take them literally. The favorite metaphor? Brahman is like the sun or light whose rays fall on and illuminate many things. Think about what this metaphor captures. Light reveals everything without being changed by what it reveals. Light is everywhere present yet remains distinct. Light makes seeing possible but isn't itself seen as an object. This metaphor becomes absolutely crucial for later Vedanta traditions, especially Shankara's. The sacred texts may occasionally mislead us in trying to describe Brahman in ways we can grasp. For instance, when texts suggest Brahman has size, Bādarāyaṇa says this isn't literally true. Brahman has no particular dimensions because nothing other than it exists. It's everywhere, pervading all things rather than occupying space the way objects do. It's formless in itself, even though it takes on all forms. Here's the paradox at the heart of Vedanta. How do you talk about something that transcends all categories? How do you describe the formless? The Upaniṣads try through metaphor, through negation. Not this, through paradox. And Bādarāyaṇa is doing the careful exegetical work of distinguishing literal claims from metaphorical ones, showing us how to read these texts properly. Now we need to talk about a serious philosophical dispute, because Bādarāyaṇa's insistence that Brahman is the material cause of all things brings him into direct conflict with another Hindu school, Samkhya. And this conflict takes up sustained attention in the text. Samkhya sees the world as evolving naturally from an underlying material stuff called pradhana or prakrti. This is unintelligent matter that just naturally develops according to its own principles. Though Samkhya positions itself within the Brahmanical tradition, on this score it's diametrically opposed to Vedanta. Far from recognizing an intelligent divine creator mind that manifests as all things, Samkhya has everything generated from unintelligent stuff. Bādarāyaṇa's response? He invokes the most familiar proof for an intelligent creator, the universe's striking, apparently providential order. But he doesn't use a stock example, he uses a livestock example. Trying to get the world we see out of pradhana without Brahman would be like trying to get milk out of grass without a cow. The grass doesn't become milk on its own. You need the living cause, the cow, to transform grass into milk. But here's what's crucial. This isn't just a philosophical dispute. It's bound up with an exegetical dispute. Bādarāyaṇa wants us to see not just that Samkhya theory makes no sense, but that it cannot make sense of key Upanishadic texts. Shankara later develops extensive exegesis to show that Samkhya misinterprets passages from the Katha Upanishad and elsewhere. The text also sets its face against more radical forms of materialism. If we rely only on sensation and material causes, we could never attain liberation, which is the whole point. Materialist explanations fail for the world as a whole and for the human individual, because the self is independent of the body. Alright, here we come to what may be the single most famous and most contested teaching of the Vedanta Sutra. What's the relationship between Brahman and the individual self? Now, if you know anything about Indian philosophy, you probably know Shankara's answer. They're identical. Advaita Vedanta, non-dualism, insists that nothing is real apart from Brahman, including every individual self. The apparent fact that each of us is distinct from other things and from the ground of existence is actually an illusion. And Shankara can draw on compelling evidence from the Vedanta Sutra to support this. Bādarāyaṇa suggests there's ultimately no difference between Brahman as cause and the things it creates. He tells us Brahman is identical with our vital breath, and instructs us to grasp Brahman by meditating on it as our own self. But, and this is a big but, other passages seem to draw a firm distinction between the individual self and the highest self that is Brahman. So which is it? Are we identical to Brahman or distinct from it? Here's what blew my mind when I really dug into this text. The Vedanta Sutra deliberately holds this relationship in tension between identity and difference. It's not that Bādarāyaṇa couldn't make up his mind. The ambiguity seems intentional. Look at this passage. Brahman relates to individual selves like a snake to its coils. Are the coils the same as the snake or different from it? Both? Neither? The metaphor itself is ambiguous. We know from the text that earlier scholars, pre-Bādarāyaṇa commentators on the Upaniṣads, already had different ideas. Some said Brahman is the material constituent of individual selves. Others said selves are distinct from Brahman but become identical once liberated from the body. The debate was already raging. So where does this leave us? The Vedanta Sutra's ambiguity on the self-Brahman relationship wasn't a bug. It was a feature. This tension allowed multiple interpretive traditions to develop, each claiming to be the true reading of Badarayana. Shankara made the radical move, or at least made it explicit, of declaring that the apparent distinction between self and Brahman is pure illusion maya. Only Brahman is real. This is outright monism, and it became the most famous interpretation of Vedanta. But other schools emerged too. Ramanuja developed qualified non-dualism. Individual selves are real but exist as modes or attributes of Brahman. Madhva went even further, arguing for dualism. Self and Brahman are eternally distinct. All three claim to be the authentic interpretation of the Vedanta Sutra. Later Vedantins treated three texts as authoritative sources: the Upaniṣads, the Vedanta Sutra, and the Bhagavad Gita. This became known as the Triple Foundation, Prasthana-traya. Shankara commented on all three, establishing a model that later interpreters followed. Here's what's remarkable. A single 5th century text, deliberately ambiguous on key philosophical questions, generated centuries of sophisticated philosophical debate and multiple schools of thought. The Vedanta Sutra's compressed cryptic style wasn't just a literary choice. It created space for interpretation, for commentary, for ongoing philosophical inquiry. And that brings us full circle to where we started. Exegesis as philosophy. The question, what is real, becomes, what does the text really say? The question, what am I, becomes, how should we interpret these passages about self and Brahman? Philosophy and interpretation are inseparable in this tradition. The Vedanta Sutra gave Indian philosophy one of its most productive tensions, the relationship between individual self and ultimate reality, and left it deliberately unresolved. That wasn't a failure of philosophical clarity. It was an invitation to think, to interpret, to engage. And Indian philosophers have been accepting that invitation for 1500 years.